In autumn 1450, a man sleeps 20 feet from a fire. The fire is 15 tons of oak, stacked into a dome taller than a man and buried under turf and soil. It has been smouldering for 6 days. It will smoulder for 6 more. And in all that time, he must never see a flame. One flame means air has broken into the mound. Air means the whole stack burns to ash, and a month of work burns with it. His job is not to keep the fire alive. Any child in the village can do that. His job is to stop a fire from finishing, day and night, for nearly 2 weeks. He is making the fuel that built swords, bells, coins, and gunpowder. The world still makes over 50 million tons of it every year. His craft is the part that died. Tonight we follow one burn from standing tree to forge fire and find out how modern industry ended this craft without ever passing a law. If you had asked anyone in the nearest village about the men out in the woods, you would have gotten a look. Colliers, they were called. They lived among the trees for weeks at a stretch, black to the elbows, sleeping in turf huts beside their own smoke. Respectable people kept their distance, yet every horseshoe in the parish, every church bell, every minted penny had passed through a collier's fire first. This is the story of the most important craftsman nobody wanted as a neighbour. It ends, strangely, with Henry Ford. It starts with a problem every medieval smith knew by heart. An open wood fire is a weak tool. It tops out somewhere around 800 degrees Celsius. That is enough to cook a meal, warm a hall, or fire a rough pot. It is nowhere near enough to work iron. A smith needs his metal glowing white, well past 1200 degrees, before 2 bars will weld into one. A bell founder needs his bronze fully molten. Medieval Europe was packed with crafts that raw wood simply could not power. And wood had a second flaw: weight. Logs are heavy, medieval roads were mud, and hauling timber more than a few miles could cost more than the timber itself was worth. If a town wanted serious heat, nobody could afford to ship the forest in. Therefore, the forest had to be refined where it stood. Out among the trees, wood would be converted into something lighter, fiercer, and worth carrying. Charcoal is what remains when you drive everything out of wood except its carbon. Pound for pound, it holds roughly twice the energy of seasoned timber. It burns hot enough to weld iron. And a sack of it weighs so little that a single packhorse could carry a smithy's supply for a week. Hold on to that trade, because the entire craft lives inside it. To make wood better than wood, you must burn most of it away without ever letting it burn up. That sounds impossible. It very nearly is. How do you half burn 15 tons of wood on purpose? First you need the right wood, cut the right way. Colliers burned what the woodland gave them, oak and beech for the forge, alder and willow when the powder mills were buying. They wanted it in billets, lengths about as thick as a man's arm. Green timber full of sap would sulk and steam for days, so the wood was cut in winter and left to dry into summer. A burn was planned months before it was ever lit. By the time the collier began to build, the season was already half spent, which is one reason he could not afford to lose a single mound. The build started with the ground. A collier cut a level circle into the hillside, maybe 15 paces across, scraped clean and packed hard. In the north of England, these platforms were called pitsteads, and a good one was reused for generations. The site mattered more than it looks. Wind was already the enemy at this stage, so colliers favoured sheltered ground, a dip in the hillside, a stand of trees as a windbreak. Water mattered too, a stream close enough to fetch from, because before this was over, the collier was going to need it. At the centre of the circle, he drove a tall stake. Around that stake, the wood went up like a puzzle. Split lengths stood on end in rings, leaning inward, tier stacked on tier, until the pile rose into a dome higher than the man who built it. Done well, the stack sat tight as a barrel. Done badly, it was a bonfire waiting for permission. Then the collier buried it. First a skin of bracken, straw, or coarse grass over the whole dome, then a coat of earth and turf, beaten down, sealing every gap. When he finished, the woodpile had disappeared. What stood on the pitstead looked like a burial mound, and in a sense it was one. The wood inside was about to be cooked in its own grave, starved of the one thing every fire begs for: air. Now came the dangerous part. The collier pulled the centre stake, leaving a chimney that ran down into the heart of the mound. Down that shaft he dropped glowing embers and dry kindling until fire took hold at the core. And then he did the thing that defines the whole craft. He sealed the chimney shut. Inside the mound, the fire found itself trapped. Starved of air, wood cannot truly burn. It breaks down instead. Heat spreads outward from the core, and the timber around it begins to sweat. Water boils off first. Then the tars and gases cook out, layer by layer, ring by ring. What stays behind is a black skeleton of nearly pure carbon. The mound was not a fire in any normal sense. It was a slow chemical engine, and the collier was its governor. He steered it by smoke. In the first days, the mound breathed thick white clouds, the water leaving as steam. As the days passed, the smoke thinned and turned bluish, the sign of tar burning off deeper in the stack. When the smoke ran thin and almost clear above one flank, that side was done, and the collier cut small vents at the base to pull the burn toward the parts still raw. He was reading a buried, invisible fire the way a physician reads a pulse. Nose, eyes, and the feel of heat through soil. He also listened. A working mound settles as the charred wood shrinks, sighing and crackling under its crust, and an experienced burner could hear where the fire had finished and where it still had work to do. He rarely did any of it alone. Charcoal burning was family work, wives and children hauling billets, cutting turf, watching one flank of the mound while the burner slept his broken sleep. Several mounds often ran at once, staggered a few days apart, so that one was always being built, one burning, one cooling. The camp moved through the wood across the season, following the cut. It was a hard, smoke-cured, wandering life, and whole families lived it for generations. And even with help, the burner could never truly walk away. A burn this size ran 10 days and more, and it ran through the nights. Wind was the enemy. A gust finding a crack could wake real flame inside the mound in minutes, and open flame meant the stack was eating itself. The collier patched cracks with turf, watched the smoke, and slept beside his work in a hut of poles and sod a few steps away. Tradition says some colliers sat on one-legged stools, so that if sleep took them, the fall would wake them. Rain was almost as dangerous as wind. A hard downpour could crack the baked crust or chill one flank and stall the burn, so the collier worked in weather that kept everyone else indoors, patching his sealed volcano by lantern light while the storm tried to pry it open. The mound could take more than a season's pay. As the wood inside shrank, hollows opened under the crust. A man walking the dome to patch a vent could step on soil that looked solid and drop through into the glowing core, and there are accounts of colliers dying exactly that way. Respectable people kept their distance from the soot. The colliers themselves were gambling with far worse. Day and night, patch and vent, smoke and sleep. The collier could have opened the mound once the smoke ran clear at the crown. He did not dare. Opened hot, the whole mass would flash into open fire the moment air touched it. He smothered the vents instead and let the mound cool sealed, sometimes for days, while the fire inside slowly suffocated. Then came the reckoning. The collier raked back the crust, and out of the black interior came the payoff. The logs had kept their shape, every ring and every knot, but they came out silvery black, light as bone, and they rang like glass when they knocked together. The arithmetic looked like robbery. 5 tons of wood had gone in. Roughly 1 ton of charcoal came out. 4 tons of a winter's cutting had vanished into the sky. Except the ton that remained was worth the theft. Ounce for ounce it held about twice the punch of the wood it came from, and it burned with almost no smoke and no sulphur. Fed with a bellows, it pushed a forge past the welding heat of iron into temperatures no open wood fire in Europe could touch. That is a furnace's worth of power in sacks a packhorse could carry. Moving it was its own small skill. Charcoal is brittle, and every rough mile on a pack saddle shook some of the load into worthless dust, so the burns crept as close to the forges as the woods allowed, and strings of pack horses filed out of the valleys with sacks riding high. Smiths paid by the load and grumbled about the price in every market town in Europe. There was no substitute, and everyone involved knew it. And it turns out the burn left a signature that has outlived everything else in this story. Charcoal does not rot. The organisms that dismantle every fallen log within a few decades cannot digest it. The black dust trodden into those pitsteads has stayed black. Walk the old coppice country of northern England today, and the platforms are still there, level circles cut into the hillsides, their soil still dark after 500 years. In the Lake District alone, archaeologists have mapped them by the thousand, and industry's fingerprints preserved in carbon. The Middle Ages left us very few records of ordinary working lives. The colliers accidentally drew their own map. Because this was never just one mound in one wood. Nearly every high-heat craft in medieval Europe stood downstream of a clamp. The smith welding a plough iron, the founder pouring a bell, the moneyer melting silver for pennies, the powder maker grinding willow charcoal for gunpowder. All of them burned the collier's harvest. Whole woodlands ran on cutting cycles timed to feed the burns, and the charcoal seasons turned with the farming year. An invisible trade running for centuries, holding up every visible one. And the appetite only climbed. When blast furnaces began replacing the old smelting hearths in England around 1500, each one was a giant that never slept. Historians estimate a single furnace could consume the yearly growth of several thousand acres of managed woodland. The colliers were no longer supplying a craft, they were fueling an industry, and the industry was starting to outgrow them. None of that has to stay locked in the past, by the way. The hands-on side of this channel exists for exactly this reason. Old skills you can still put your own hands on. If this video leaves you wanting to make something real yourself, that is the whole idea behind the Medieval Way store. It starts with the Medieval Bakery Collection, 3 digital guides. The Practical Recipes book walks you through the loaves themselves. The Sourdough Manual shows you how to raise and keep a living leaven. And the Sourcing Guide tells you where to find proper heritage grain. The bread is where the hands-on part begins. By 1709, in a valley in Shropshire, the countdown on this entire way of life had already started. England's ironmasters had a problem the colliers could no longer solve. Furnaces were multiplying, and each one was a bottomless stomach. Pamphleteers had warned for a century that the kingdom was eating its woods faster than they could regrow, and laws had tried to fence the ironworks away from the best timber. Nobody listened for long. The deeper truth was harder. Even where the woods survived, charcoal capped how big the iron trade could ever get, because a furnace could only grow as large as the forest that fed it. Coal looked like the obvious answer, and coal kept failing. Raw coal is dirty fuel. Its sulphur creeps into molten iron and leaves the metal brittle, good for little but the scrap heap. For generations, iron and coal refused to mix. Then Abraham Darby, a Quaker metalworker from Bristol, tried something borrowed from the malt houses. Maltsters had learned to bake coal into coke, cooking off its filth, before it ever touched their grain. In 1709 at Coalbrookdale, Derby smelted iron with coke, and it worked. Slowly, furnace by furnace, decade by decade, the method spread. 70 years later, his grandson threw the world's first iron bridge across the Severn, cast entirely with coke-fired metal, a short walk from that first furnace. Notice what actually happened there. Coke was not a rejection of the collier's craft. It was the collier's craft, aimed at a rock. Bake the raw fuel in a sealed oven, drive off the poisons, keep the carbon. Industry never abandoned the medieval trick. Industry scaled it beyond anything a forest could match, because a coal seam does not need 20 years to regrow and does not care about the weather. Nobody banned charcoal. No parliament debated the colliers. The orders simply moved year by year toward the coal fields. You would think a trade that old would go out with some kind of ceremony. It went out in silence. Charcoal iron lingered where wood stayed cheap, in Sweden and in the American forests, deep into the 1800s. Brazil still smelts some of its iron with charcoal today on eucalyptus plantations grown for the purpose, a strange modern echo of the medieval fuel woods. In the Lake District, colliers were still burning coppice charcoal for the gunpowder works into the early 20th century. Then the last orders dried up, and a craft that had run unbroken for well over 1,000 years quietly stopped. The strangest monument is the word itself. Collier once meant a man who made charcoal in the woods. As the trade migrated, the word migrated with it, first to the coal miner, then to the coal ship. English kept the job title and handed it to the thing that killed the job. If the story had stopped there, this would be a museum piece. It did not stop. In the 1920s, Henry Ford was staring at mountains of scrap hardwood left over from building Model T frames and floorboards, and Ford hated waste more than he hated his competitors. He had the scrap chipped, charred without air, and pressed into neat pillows of charcoal, then sold the bags through his own dealerships as picnic fuel, right beside the cars that carried the picnickers. The operation was later renamed for the relative by marriage who helped set it up, a man called Kingsford. That name now sits on the bag at half the barbecues in America. And no, I am not making that up. The collier's mound had become a factory line. The craft died. The chemistry never blinked. And the chemistry is now living a second life that has nothing to do with grilling. Remember that charcoal in the ground refuses to rot. Centuries before Columbus, farmers in the Amazon worked charred material into their fields, and patches of that soil, called terra preta, are still darker and more fertile than the ground a few steps away. Modern soil scientists went to study it and came away converted. Today the same idea is sold as biochar. Companies are paid to bake waste wood into charcoal and bury it, locking carbon into soil for centuries, and farmers use it to hold water and nutrients in poor ground. The 21st century is paying to put the collier's product back into the earth. Not because the old fuel was better than the new one, because the old trick solves a problem we have only just admitted we have. You can run the trick yourself this weekend at kitchen scale. Take a tin with a tight lid, an old cookie tin works, punch one small hole in the top and pack it with dry sticks. Set it in the embers of a campfire or wood stove. Smoke will jet from the hole. When that jet burns thin and clear, the cook is done. Let the tin cool completely before opening, the same rule the colliers died learning. Inside, your wood will have turned black, light and ringing. Crush it for the garden or save it for the grill. 15 tons or 15 sticks, it is the same chemistry. Somewhere in northern England tonight, rain is falling on a level black circle that has not grown a tree in 500 years. The man who slept beside it never saw his fire. That was the whole point. We recover the skills the modern world misplaced. Subscribe for more. What surprised you most? The smoke reading, the 5-to-1 math, or the Ford twist? Until next time, stay curious.